Hi, I'm Arlen Walker, and I am live from Helm's Wasteland. And today I am joined by John-Matthew DeFoggi, who is a author of RPGs and also has a YouTube channel, Iconic Productions,
Yeah.
um, and all sorts of other cool stuff. And we are here to talk about the Second Apocalypse book series by R. Scott Bakker. I assume that's how I have always assumed that Baker is the way to pronounce his name.
So I always called it Bakker, but after listening to interviews, it is Baker. So
Oh
you,
well,
as far as I understand it, you were correct.
well that was the I think so. So when I had first picked up this particular series when I was like 15. And my first thought was, oh, that's not spelled like Baker, so it shouldn't be. And then I thought about it for a little longer and was like, oh, well, I think Baker sounds like a real name and Backer doesn't sound like a real name.
Yeah.
But okay, so that's a good segue into how did you discover this particular series?
So I was deep into the Malazan books of the Fallen, which I discovered I had been pronouncing wrong my entire life. I thought it was Malazan, and then I was publicly reprimanded. No, I was I was corrected. Um, and I mean, we might even talk a little bit about that because that's how the audiobooks pronounce it, right?
Yeah.
And I found Gardens of the Moon I promise this all comes back around because on the cover of Gardens of the Moon, in my local Barnes& and Noble, it had a quote by Stephen R. Donaldson, who's one of my favorite fantasy authors. I love the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. And so I was walking through Barnes& and Noble one day and saw the darkness that comes before, and there was a quote from Stephen Erickson that said, "Hey, if you're paying attention, you need to read this book." And I'm like, well, the dominoes just fell, and I picked up, and that opening prologue had me hooked. I read the prologue in the Barnes and Noble and walked out with the book. I think I immediately went on vacation to Oregon, and we went book hounding, and I found the next next two books in the series, and that was all that was out at the time, was just The Prince of Nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's really funny because so I think I've read a tiny bit of Donaldson, but I haven't read Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. But I had a similar experience in I was reading some of the Malazan books, and I think I had finished Memories of Ice,
Oh, so
um,
good.
and got to the bookstore and was like, okay, well, I'll find the next books. And it was like a recommended, if you like Stephen Erickson's books, you'll like, and it was just the first three that were out at that point. I was like, oh, well, I should check out The Darkness That Comes Before and these other ones, and ended up being totally hooked on this particular series. And then, of course,
Yeah.
having to wait for more of them, which was the other weird thing with my version of reading through this, is because I read those first three when they were all out, and then I read The Judging Eye when it came out, and then I read White Luck when it came out. But by the time that The Great Ordeal and The Unholy Consult had come out, I wasn't really reading much of these kind of big fantasy doorstoppers.
Yeah.
Mostly because I had done so much of that in like high
Yeah.
school that I was like, oh, I need to do something else for a while,
Yeah.
especially kind of in college and after. And so for me, I only got to The Great Ordeal and The Unholy Consult just this past year and have now read the whole thing. Even though I think it's interesting because reading through it, I was like, oh, I kind of knew that this was where it had to end up, right? That this is
Yeah.
the trajectory that makes sense. And so much of, I think it speaks to so much of the like things that happen in the books really feel like that, where you wouldn't have necessarily said ahead of time, oh, this is what's going to happen, but when it happens,
Hmm.
like, oh, of course it had to lead in this direction because that kind of
Well,
fits with the
and it is
ethos.
titled The Second Apocalypse. So
Yeah.
it like I got to the end and I had the same experience, and then a game designer friend of mine who actually I got also helped me get into it because in the kind of appendix N of Adventure Conqueror King, he lists these books as like influences,
uh
and he hated the second series. And we actually I had a chance to talk about
Really.
about him, but I was like, but Alex, man, it's called the Second Apocalypse. It's not called and how the Second Apocalypse was foiled. It's like
That's funny. I
yeah.
could see how it would feel tough, especially because I mean, trying not to get into too much spoilers, but right near at the end, it feels like, oh, it's going to be different. Like it's
Oh, it
so
does.
close to, like, this is all gonna like sort of work out, maybe.
Every time I read it, I'm like, it's like when I read the Children of Hurin. When I reread
Yeah.
the Children of Hurin, I'm like, maybe this time it'll be
Yeah.
different. And I get to the end, and it never changes.
And it's I think it is really, and even I was thinking about it also because I was left with the end of White Luck where they get to, I guess this will get into, why don't we just get into spoilers, because I'm realizing it's going to be hard
Spoiler
to talk
alert.
about.
We're going to talk about.
If you haven't read these books, you can at least read the first one is great and will give you a taste for what a lot of the stuff is like, and don't spoil yourself on a lot of the other stuff because there's some pretty big things that happen. Although even, I mean, we talked a little bit at one point about even from like the very beginning, when you go back to it, it's like, oh, all of the stuff, that the whole Kelmomian prophecy is in like the first couple chapters, right?
Yeah.
And all of the kind of setup for the big events that are not going to happen for, books and books later is right there, right at the beginning, which is crazy.
Yeah. And I think there's a big tone shift. And this comes from several conversations that I've had with other people who have read it. And I've read a lot of Bakker's cognitive papers that he's put out.
Mm-hmm.
So what's interesting is when he wrote the first trilogy and so I guess we should say that if like the Malazan books are military fantasy and you have all these different types of fantasy, this is really like philosophical fantasy.
Yeah, there's a lot of philosophy, both kind of explicitly discussed and really implicit in the way that like the world is structured.
Right. And if we talk about magic, but he was an exceptionalist in the first, which is a philosophical and cognitive behavior or cognitive development belief that like mankind's sentience is exceptional and unique.
Mm-hmm.
And then between the two trilogy or the two series, he switched really into what's called a mediocritist point of view, where he's like, hey, we're just products of evolution, and anyone could develop sentience, so humanity isn't special. And I think you can see that between the two series. Like you get to the end of the first series and you're like, we can do it. We're Kelmo or Anasarimber is going to lead us.
Kellis to take the reins and be like, this is time. We're going to do it.
And he's exceptional, and he's going. And then you get to the end of the second one, you're like, oh, all is salt and fire and dust.
Yep. Well, and that's also, it's interesting, I think, rereading and realizing how much that first trilogy is so human-centric and so kind of historic, right? It's so closely based on the events of the First Crusade.
100%.
And it is, like, there is fantasy stuff, but the fantasy stuff is really easy to understand within the framework of this kind of historical lens, right? Like wizards are basically just really, really deadly siege engines that are
they're artillery pieces.
Yeah. They're not really like the way they become later on in the series. And then the second, the tetralogy of the Aspect Emperor is so fantasy, right? That you have so many more of these kind of, the ancient places of the world and all of these things that have been going on for so long, and the way that the wars have just sort of continued festering on over time. And of course, obviously that, like, now we're fighting Srank, and now we're kind of dealing with all of these
dragons.
All of these things that we sort of had a little bit of a glimpse at earlier on, right? Like we know that dragons exist in the first trilogy because we've seen, Seswatha's dreams about dragons, and we have the dragon head magic that's like the most powerful thing that that some of the sorcerers can do, but we haven't really seen this kind of the fantastical, and especially I think the non-men become such a part of that for me, as
Oh
the
yeah.
the way that it's a little bit like in the Lord of the Rings, the difference between the parts of the story in like Rivendell or Lothlorien and the parts that are in like Rohan
Oh
or
yeah.
Gondor, right?
Yeah, and in the Judging Eye, um, there's a scene that is the most amazing homage to Moria
Yes.
while being even scarier than Moria, right?
Yes,
It's the halls of Kilages are just, they're terrifying. They're just terrifying.
well, and I think that's one of the things that I identified as really liking even very early on in the series, is that there's a way that I think so much of this, the sort of material of this world and the story has kind of grown out of kind of a response to or a deconstruction of a lot of the fantasy concepts that you've seen in
Mm-hmm.
other stories, especially the Lord of the Rings. I mean, I remember getting to the stuff in Golgotha and being like, oh, the occlusion is like a perfect logical reasoning for there to be mountains around the evil place, is that it's a crater
Yes,
site. And
it's a
being
crater site,
like,
exactly.
yeah, and being like, oh, well, so that sort of seems like somebody asking, well, why does Mordor have mountains all around it and it's so hard to get to? And that's there's not really a logical explanation in Tolkien's version, but in this, there's like, oh, there's a specific reason that these kind of fantasy elements, and the same way with all of the stuff with the end of the Judging Eye and Kill Algis and the descent that is very much like Moria.
Yeah.
All of the, I mean, even the classic, the ancient kingdoms of the high north that are divided amongst the three branches of the Inasarimber
Mm-hmm.
line. That's it's sort of like ancient Arnor being divided into the three, but it's got its own kind of different
Oh yeah.
flavor. And
Well, I think I don't. This was based off of his D&D game.
yeah,
Like
I
his
read.
brother posted some like a write up from one of their D&D, and like had the poetry and it had the philosophy and it had like the names were very close to what we were
Yeah, I
what
think
we get to experience in the
the
books.
villain in because I read the article, and the villain is
Yeah,
like Mechatrig already
yeah,
in
yeah,
the, like, as a kid coming up with the stuff.
yeah. Which
Uh,
is so that's. I mean, I'll be honest. Jackals is heavily inspired by the second apocalypse.
yeah,
Like the idea that like, hey, if you squint, you can see, okay, so right, um, you know, especially in the first trilogy, like you said, okay, well, this is Byzantine
mhm.
Rome, and then this is this is Sumna is clearly Rome, and they're sending people to Byzant. So I liked that it was historical analog that still felt like a real world, not just the real world with the serial numbers filed off, if that
Yes.
makes sense.
And I think he
Erwa feels like a real place in the same way that like Middle Earth feels like a real place. Robert Jordan's
yes.
world is great and I love it, but it never felt like a real place. It just felt like the place where all of this stuff is happening.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Baker really ties into, I mean, I've talked before about the idea of to my mind, one of the things that a lot of fantasy stories get wrong is basically writing a fantasy world like a D&D world book, and not like basically like a travelogue in the real world. And I remember years and years ago when I was in college, one of my creative writing professors said, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf is the best world building ever put into a novel. And what he meant, of course, was that there's world building that happens in all stories. World building as a concept gets tied to speculative fiction, right? Sci-fi and fantasy often, but that you really,
Yeah.
anytime you're writing a story, you have to explain the nature of the world and give people access to it. And that what he was essentially saying on some level was, right, more worlds more like how Mrs. Dalloway communicates what London of the 20s
Oh
is
yeah,
like, than like how, say a world book for D&D is like, because this is how people experience a world. And that's what
yeah.
you're really getting to. And I think this series does such a great job of all of the little cultural details that, especially
Hmm.
seeing, I was thinking about, it's so fun to see like different expressions of the same cultural anxieties across different versions. So like the Aeoni, and they paint their faces before battle, versus the
Yeah.
Conrians, they wear masks, and it's like,
The,
oh, that's. And then is it the Galioth that they tattoo their faces?
they tattoo their faces
And
and they weave skulls into their
yeah, and
beards, and
it's like,
yeah,
oh, this is all like the same stuff. This is like different people getting at the same problem in different ways, in a way that feels so interesting to engage with, because it also ties in, I think, to what so much of thematically the book is about, of the way that, like, oh, they're all like, they just think that these are different because they don't see how they're the same, basically, because they've
right.
grown up in their culture, and they're like, oh, this is what we do, and this is different than what those other people do. And that
Yeah.
somebody like Kellis, who comes in and has not been living in a culture like that, is like, oh yeah, this is all the same stuff, and I know how to deal with all that.
Right. And the main character is there's a great article called, I don't know if you've read Freedom in an Unfree Universe.
I have
It
not.
is it's an article that compares Dune and the Second Apocalypse.
Hmm.
And so they really make the link between Paul Atreides, who is this, you know, trained from birth to be essentially a superhuman, right? He's a
Yeah.
mentat. He, is the Quintessence Haderach. He gets trained by the Fremen. Like, no one can touch Paul. And yet, because of his visions of the future, he is sort of bound to this fated path. And they compare it to Anastur Berkelis, who is this genetically engineered super warrior who is dropped into a fantasy setting,
Yeah.
and almost mentat like abilities allow him to, they keep referring to, um, what's the line in the Aspect Emperor that's repeated over, we are like children to them, like Nair keeps saying, we are like children to them. And um, because he can see and remove himself from the world on a level and observe it with this almost third person omniscient in the local, he is able to manipulate everything. But he can see how, well, you're doing this because you're hiding your shame for having to kill someone, which is identical to what you're doing, which is identical to what they're doing. But again, yeah, culturally you have this pride, right? One of the quotes from, so every chapter starts with a little philosophical quote in world text, right? But like, each man is the center of his own circle, and that
Mm.
circle is the world. There's something like
Yeah.
that, right? Like, everybody's like, no, this is our thing. You wouldn't understand it. And of course, Kellis just kind of steps into it and like just starts weaving all of these strings together.
Well, and it's such a. I was joking that in some ways it's so funny, because I really like this series, in the same way as thinking about like the sort of fantasy elements. There is an element to me of like, Kellis is sort of like the perfect like smart guy fantasy, basically, of like the
Mm-hmm.
idea is like, wouldn't it be really cool to be the kind of smart guy who's so smart that all the other smart guys are dumb by comparison.
Yes.
But that's, I think, part of why it's so fun, because it is such a kind of fascinating exploration of what that kind of character in this world is like. But also, really, so much of the story ends up being kind of in the background at times, about like, what does he like actually believe, and what is he actually experiencing. And so much, like, I remember first reading in the Warrior-Prohpet, when he gets hung up on the circumfix and he has his vision, and being like, is he actually experiencing this vision of the no god? Is that part of, does he like go insane from this traumatic experience? Is that what this whole series is ultimately about?
Well, and
As
then in the recaps, because I mean, honestly, the recaps the Aspect Emperor, where the thing where it's the war as a rule
Yep.
falls within the compass of history. That whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Bakker flat out tells us Kellis went crazy on the
Yeah.
tree.
Yeah.
What? Like I wasn't prepared for that, and man, I could talk about this like.
Well, and I think it's interesting because it also ties into so much of like, so one of the ideas in the book is the mandate, the Seswatha's mandate, and that's how men will never forget the danger of another apocalypse, is that they will dream the events of the first apocalypse
over and over every night,
every night, over and over. And even though, I mean, a number of the characters that we see are Mandati and believe in this sort of stuff, and all of these other people don't believe in them.
They're ridiculed. They're basically the Cassandra character standing on the walls of Troy saying it's coming, it's happening, and everybody's like, it's been thousands of years. Nothing is going to do this.
Yes, but then there's I think two things that are really interesting about, like, when you get into the tetralogy, the Aspect Emperor stuff, there is a recognition of like, oh my god, this is crazy. This is like 20 years ago nobody believed in this, and now the like whole armed might of this world-spanning empire is about to march into nowhere to deal with this thing that people believe in now, even though they had no idea about. But then there's also kind of a interesting question of so one of the things that happened in my life fairly recently is that I figured out I wasn't getting very good sleep and got a CPAP machine because I was having very bad sleep apnea. And that has sort of led me to doing a lot of research on the benefits of sleep and rereading it and thinking, oh my God, the mandate are all like not, even though they know about this, Seswatha sort of messed up and they can't like make rational decisions about their existence because none of them are getting good sleep and are able to engage with. And that's so interesting because it's such a like fascinating kind of taking this logical concept all the way through the idea of like, okay, they know about this, but the people who set this system up weren't perfect. And they have really, in some ways, right, I think similar to the Dune concept of like Dune is all about how like the things that make you strong are actually what make you weak. And that in the same way, there's a lot of that going on here of the mandate know about all of this, but they just don't have like the basic mental capacity to run things the way they want to deal with all these things because they're all sleep deprived the entire time.
And then add into that the unreliable narrator that we discover that Seswatha is.
Yes.
Because in the first trilogy, the dreams are presented as this, not so much prophetic, but sort of like a prophetic. It's because, right, it's a historical retelling.
But it is
like,
at least
they're
like
living,
definitive.
Yeah, they're reliving the life of Seswatha. So they're able, it would be like reliving the life of Achilles because everyone knows the sagas. They know what happened during the first apocalypse. They can pick up and read, the Iliad and the Odyssey. But the Mandati, like when they dream, they're Achilles and Odysseus living through in kind of scattered dream logic the events of the sagas. And then, and I personally think it's because Kellis talks to the Seswatha spirit inside of
when he gets the gnosis
Akamian,
right? When he hypnotizes, sort of thing.
His dreams change, and suddenly we're like, well, you're not a reliable narrator. Like you are like a flawed human being who may have been the father of this great hero that everyone attributes to your best friend, like. And why is Akamian being gifted with these visions at this time is linked to all sorts of different things.
It's well, and even I mean, I mentioned to you on Discord about this idea of the Aeolus, this helmet that is
I love that thing
like
so much.
That's how the non-men figured out to be like, okay, well, nobody can know our language unless they've lived our lives, and so we'll create a helmet that blends your soul with the soul of one of our ancient hero warriors so that you can understand us, basically.
Yeah.
And then it's in the very last book, and Sarwa says, "Oh yeah, Saswata had that happen twice," and putting together like, oh man, and that's what he's trying to do with the dreams, right? Is that the
Yeah.
dreams are that process in a way that will be like palatable in a way that the Aviolus fundamentally isn't,
Yeah.
basically. Is
So I got to ask, have you read so there's two short stories on his website, False Sun and another one. I don't remember the name off the top of my head. Maybe did they put them at the end of?
I think so I know, yeah, False Sun is at the end of the Unholy
False Sun's at the end of this, and Four Revelations.
Yes.
And then he wrote two more Second Apocalypse stories. He wrote one that was split up over two parts in Grimdark magazine.
Yeah, the Knife of Many Hands.
Knife of Many Hands,
Yeah.
which was so good.
Yeah.
And then he did another one in Evil as a Point of View, which is one of them is basically a Conan story, and one of them is maybe an exorcism demon hunting story set in the. They're fantastic. They're just like I'm really hoping, if you're listening, I know people say this at least once a week on the Reddit, on the subreddit for Bakker, but if you're listening, I'm happy, I'm content on where it's ended. But I would love to see the No God duology come out.
Yeah.
Which also is interesting because the first two series titles refer to Kellis's role in that series, right? The Prince of Nothing, the Aspect Emperor, and he said that the third one is called the No God. I'm like, oh man. What does it mean, Bakker? What does it mean?
And it's I mean, yeah, I also I would like to see more of it, partly because I think the world is so much fun, so much of the different the kind of stuff going on, it's so fun to see. It's also I think that his version of the first apocalypse is so interesting and insane because it like, I mean, you hear there's all sorts of different versions of like apocalyptic events in fantasy stories, and this is one that I think is like the most. Oh, this is really the end, right? Like, one of the ideas is that while the No God is alive, sort of, that there aren't any. Every child is stillborn. There like aren't any new children.
Yeah, and like everything is stillborn.
Yeah.
Right. There's no new cattle. There's
it's
and the fact that everyone knows at every moment of the day, and you see it kind of happen at the end, they could go, that's where it is.
Yeah.
That's where damnation is coming from, and it's coming closer. I'm like, can you imagine the sheer terror of living through that as the No God and the Shrine Chords are coming south, and you can feel it coming for you.
Yeah. It's pretty wild.
Yeah. Did you have you read through was it Universal Encyclopedia here at the end?
Yeah,
encyclopedic glossary.
I read all of the encyclopedia stuff at the end of Unholy Consult, and there's
Did you notice how many people died in the exact same year that Kellis discovers the Deimos?
Yeah. There's a detail.
What?
Yeah, all of the veterans of the First Holy War that get killed off under mysterious circumstances. There's even, I remember reading through the encyclopedia, there's a detail right there just kind of mixed in where they talk about the Srank language and the idea that they human philosophers have said, well, how could they have a language because they cannot mean, and other people saying, well, they seem to be able to communicate, right? They're doing something. And this idea of well, what if this means that there is such a thing as like a dark language, a language that is not connected directly to meaning at all? And then right at the end, it's some philosophers have suggested that because of the nature of human tongues, that all languages are dark. And it's such a little, like, tiny little detail put in that is so much fun as a little, oh man, these are like, and I think that also ties into part of what's so fun about this is that it really takes seriously the idea that many of these people who do not have access to the same like knowledge and information that we do are not stupid. And of course that's part of the thing, is that they're in some ways misled by having partial information and also
Mm-hmm.
being able to take it somewhat seriously. There's a detail in one of the books about a Genkis or a Gensis rejecting the idea of there being like a larger like galaxy outside of the world, because how could something be so far away that it would be in the same place when you were in two different places at once? And that's such a great little like, oh, this is someone who is logically examining the evidence as best they understand and has come to
Yeah.
the wrong conclusion,
Mm-hmm.
because they're, and that's like, well, that's what like the whole series is about, is all of these
Yeah, it's
characters
all about
who
meaning
don't know.
and right, the darkness that comes before, like, and if I realize we've done you guys a horrible disservice by not explaining what the series is about while talking about what the
Yeah,
series is about.
well,
But like the fact that the dark, he puts the premise of the whole thing on the cover of the first book,
yeah.
right? That we cannot know where our thoughts come from, and he's big into the blind box, theory of the brain, where thoughts arise, and he's like really digging into that. But it's all about meaning. I mean, that's like from the way characters interact, what they're talking about, where like what you just said about having partial or corrupted information, because there are definitely hints that the Inkroi, who are kind of the big bad of the series, like manipulated the holy scriptures of humanity, like right before they came to this part of the world, so that they would work for the Inkroi kind of unbeknownst to them. And even the fact that like how magic works like magic works off meaning, like in this, and even the Kore, the things that salt a sorcerer, do so by reverting the world back to the original meaning before the because the sorcery in this setting is all about speaking essentially with the language of God and using your meaning to overwrite the meaning of the world.
Yeah.
And then there are these things that like forcibly undo that and reduce you, like just sap the vital essence out of a sorcerer, leaving a very biblical pillar of salt sort of thing.
Well, and there's a really interesting question about, because the the sort of one of the issues way back in the first trilogy is the for lack of a better term, enemy sorcerers, the Fanim, as the sort of equivalent of the various kind of Arabic Muslim kingdoms of the Near
Yeah.
East, and they have a branch of sorcery that they're Caesarim, I assume is I don't know how you pronounce it's funky words, but
So I always pronounced it Suke.
yeah, Suke is their
and the
branch
and the
of
Kisharim.
Kisharim.
But so the reason I'll say all of my pronunciations come from either my fumbling attempts through the pronunciation guide that Bakker gave us, or the first audiobook.
Okay.
The second guy's audiobook, he does fine, except he clearly did not try to sync up the pronunciations and even mispronounces the same word or name between books. Very frustrating. But yeah, the Kisharim is how I always said.
Okay,
but I know
Kisharim.
exactly what you were talking about.
Yeah, so the Kisharim, and they use Suke, and that's how they do magic, and it is indistinguishable from the real world to other magical practitioners. And so this is like a real deep question for the series, because one of the central issues is that mages are damned for what they have done. They're going to be sentenced to an eternity in one of the various hells for all of the things that they have done, and that this is what starts the consult off. The big bad of this series is the realization of the reality of their damnation, and that there is. It's one of those questions that I remembered having, of like, well, what about these guys? Because they can tell that they're the few, right? One of the magicians can look at them and see, oh, this is somebody who could be a mage, but they can't tell that they're actually doing magic stuff,
right?
Seemingly
because they don't bear the bruises on their
bear
onset,
the
right?
mark, and so therefore are they also immune to the sentence of damnation for other sorcerers, right?
Right, and the Phanom scriptures seem to say yes, that the Kisharim are to be revered and are holy, but does that actually mean anything, right? The question of damnation in this series, which is by far the grimmest and darkest of grimdark. I love Abercrombie. Abercrombie is hopeful compared to Bakker. But the question of damnation is actually one of the fundamental things. And so, like, one of the things I love about this series is that essentially you start off with Kellis as one of the main point of view characters, and as the books go along, you see less and less of his point of view, because Bakker wants you to have this kind of, as he ascends to Warrior-Prohpet status, he wants that distance between you, the reader, and Kellis, the character. It grows as the distance between him and the rest of the world grows, as he moves into this sort of deific position. But this question of damnation like runs through the whole thing, because you have the fact that, right, there's the Phanom versus the Enrithi. So basically, Christianity versus Islam. They have different views of what salvation means. They have different views of what was required for salvation. But even within Enrithiism, you have the fact that, like, there's the 1,000 gods, and then there's the one God who's the aspect of all of them. And, well, what happened, kind of an Old Testament, New Testament sort of division, also Christianity, Hinduism kind of. But what does that mean? And then as you get deeper into the series, suddenly you discover that, well, actually, because of the judging eye, which is this really interesting fact, because they talk about damnation, but Kellis is essentially, at the start of a series, a person from our world. It's not what's the term for fantasy where you get teleported from the real world into a fantasy world?
Like,
I forget.
Portal fantasy.
Fantasy is
for anime. They use the term isekai, but I don't know.
Isekai, that's the word I was looking for. But he is, for all intents and purposes, though he is born and bred in this world, he is a modern person. He has a very thoroughly modern, postmodern view of the world, right? Yeah. There is everything is a narrative that we can pull apart, and the brain is just, we're just purely biological beings as a result of, engineering or evolution. And then he gets thrown into this world where, nope, sorry, magic and damnation are real. And we get things like the judging eye, which is this weird gift given to pregnant women that allows them to see if someone is truly righteous or damned. We get the inverse fire, which is this technological device that shows you your eternal destination, which is also interesting that
it's the name of a painting, right? Like a ceiling fresco
over the tusk in the Holy of Holies, right? Is called the inverse fire. And then you discover that the main bad guys, that this whole time you thought it was a fantasy series, and it's actually not. It's like an old school AD&D, like science fantasy setting. Yeah. Because how much do we want to spoil?
Let's just go all. I mean, we've gotten most of it out. So yeah.
All right. So right. The whole series kicks off like chronologically, not in the books, but like when this spaceship filled with depraved alien monsters land on the planet, and they're here to close the world from the metaphysics so that they can live immortal, undamned lives, because the reality, the metaphysical reality, the ontological reality just won't affect them anymore. Yeah. And by the end of the series, you discover that alien race that engineered dragons and shrank, which are essentially brew from Glorantha. I don't know if you've played Glorantha, but like right down to the lasciviousness is how I will put it of the brew is captured in the shrink. You find out that all of these, the architects of all of these horrors are just engineered by another species that is long dead and gone, that was a very highly technological, materialistic species that could be us in the future. Like there's a postulation that the race that created the Inkroi is mankind at some point in our future will become so technologically advanced and so like culturally materialistic and bankrupt that when we discover damnation is real, we create servitor races that are guaranteed to be damned and instill in them a genetic desire to find a way not for redemption, but to close the world so that we can be as depraved as we want with no consequences.
Yeah.
As someone with a theology degree, I both cannot recommend the series and love it deeply because it really is a very human view of like, well, what could we do?
Well, and I think that's one of the really interesting things with the consult and the Dunyan in particular as sort of a paired match. That, I mean, people have talked online about this idea of like, well, the consult seems obviously bad to everybody living in this world, but realistically, if you take seriously this concept of damnation as eternity, is like the temporary suffering of the world worth the eternal suffering of the souls that are damned because of their existence?
Yeah.
And that's like what the end of the last book is about, basically, is the
and you have the fact that like the Dunyan, like we see Kellis confront his father at the end of the first book, and he's like, I have to kill you. And he's like, well, why? He's like, because right now you think stopping the consult is a good idea, but you're eventually going to come to the same conclusion they did, that this is the only way to save the world. Mm-hmm. And his father's like, well, clearly you've gone crazy.
Yeah.
And yet at the end, we get they call it the Dunsult on the Bakker subreddit, where it's like the Dunyan come to the consult and go, yeah, no, you're 100% correct. Yeah. Like this is it. This is
because it's like the ultimate expression of everything that the Dunyan have talked about of like, we ought to be fundamentally logical and prepared to do whatever it takes to do all these important things. And if the most important thing is avoiding damnation, then this is it. Right. And
then you get the non-men, right? Like we talked about, like the non-men, their avoidance of damnation is because they have no scriptures. They have nothing in their mythology or their culture that says damnation is avoidable. Mm-hmm. And so their whole hope for the future, aside from, I mean, obviously that's why they accept the consult's gift in the first place, which ends up damning them even faster, right, is to travel so far down into the earth and slip away into death so quietly that oblivion is what they seek. And they just pray that they're not like literally, they hope that their creator God, who went off into oblivion, might gather them quietly and hide them away from the rapacious nature of the thousand gods, because essentially you discover reality is a granary for these gluttonous deities who, while they do intervene in the world and they do answer the prayers of their people, you can't really, it's a very like Hellraiser-esque view of the afterlife, in the fact that like the screams of the damned and the sighs of the saints are identical, just depending on your point of view, because there's really no evidence that even the righteous and the saved have a better experience in this world's afterlife than those that are just being constantly thrown down the maws of hungry Sifrang demons and gods. It's a very bleak. Well, and if you think if you have problems with Martin and the way he writes and the stuff he puts in there, Bakker is also responding to Martin in a lot of ways, in where he's like, you are only okay when bad things happen to women.
Yes.
And the history of the world says bad things happen to everyone. I'm trying not to get your channel like demonetized or anything.
I think it is fair to say there is a lot of, there's a lot of sexual violence in these books.
Yes.
And I agree that I think there is a strong point being made about the way that fantasy and this idea of like dark fantasy that takes these things seriously has
Yeah.
become okay with versions of that and not others, and
Right.
especially versions that victimize women versus versions that victimize
Oh,
men as a big
100%.
distinction.
Yeah. And Bakker has gone on record saying, like, the link, it reminds me of the Bush song, right? You're okay with sex and your violence,
Mhm.
right? We're okay with it in a certain degree. And he's like, we should never be okay with it in our fantasy or in our real life. So I'm going to make it as uncomfortable as possible for you because I don't want you to be okay
Yeah.
with it. And he's like, I'm not doing it because I get joy or I have some sort of perverse desire to write these scenes. But these are scenes that have been captured in the records of the Crusades. These are things that we know that happen. And they happen so often in fantasy books and are glossed over. No, like these should always be horrific when we encounter them, no matter where we encounter them.
Yes.
And they are. And so I have this story. So in Glorantha, there is this beastman race called the Brew, and the Brew, again, I'll talk around it, can and will impregnate anything. And I have this, like, I ran this really like 3-year long RuneQuest Glorantha game, and session 0, we're sitting down and explaining the world, and I'm explaining the Brew. And what was really interesting to me is the group was split 50-50 men and women. And the women were like, okay, yeah, no, I understand. And the guys were horrified that like their male characters might be encountering this. And I was like, well, that's interesting. Like half the table was like, well, that's the reality of the world, that you have to be on guard or else something bad would happen to you. And the other half went, what am I going to do? And I'm like, I think that's what Bakker's trying to do here. Bakker's trying to say
exactly that's so much of the way. Well, and especially it ties in with, I think he also takes basically the problem of all sorts of other forms of misogyny really seriously too.
Yes.
Right? That
Yes.
so much of, I think when I was younger, I didn't realize just how much and how different it was than a lot of these other stories, to be like, oh no, actually this is like a world where women officially have less rights than men, and women are not allowed to do all these different things and are like legally and theologically expected to be subservient. That's the basis of this. And making a point that that's like, there's a lot of cultures historically where that was just like what it was like, and that acting like that wasn't.
There are places in the world today where,
yeah,
and the thing I've got to say is a lot of times people will mix up authorial intent with the author's like tacit approval.
Yes.
That's not what's going on here. You can write about dark and wrong things, or you can write about things without saying, I wholeheartedly endorse this. Bakker is not saying women are subservient or, it's a very sort of Platonic idea of, right, women are sort of the deformed masculine soul. He's not agreeing with it. He's just saying at this time in the world. And I have some people who would be like, well, you got to write better stories or you got to change it. No, you can write different stories, but you can't also vilify somebody who is like, well, hey, I'm writing a story that is set in essentially the First Crusade time. I'm not going to pull any punches here. But also don't assume that just because he's writing about it, that he's like being like, oh, the good days of the First Crusade. No, it's awful. Yeah. And we see it kind of through the lens of kind of the archetypal, right? You have the waif, the waif, the harlot, and the harridan. So you have Serwa, who is kind of the waif, the innocent, kind of the golden-haired, kind of, virginal character. Then you have Esmenet, who is clearly the harlot character in this world. And then you have, what was Darius' grandmother's name in the first series? My brain is gonna. There's so many people in here. I apologize.
There's so many. That's another word list. There's so many proper nouns in this series. There's a lot of thing, and you gotta keep track of them to tell what's going on. But it's
man, I can see it in my head, and I'm gonna. Nope, it's gone.
Well, but also that's part of. I mean, that's I think one of the kind of core arcs of the Aspect Emperor tetralogy is Esmenet struggling with her transformation from being beautiful young woman to the queen who is getting old, the empress,
the Harridan,
who is getting
and
old.
you actually get that when she's hiding with when there's the coup happens and she's hiding with the young harlot.
Mm-hmm.
She's that distance has grown even more, but you also see this transformation of this fantasy world in 20 years from a first century, not first century, but first crusade cultural world to something that resembles, like I said, Kellis's point of view is a very modern, postmodern view, right? Suddenly we have the empress is in charge, and witches are now allowed to have, and we're not drowning female babies who can use magic just because they can use magic. There's this whole school, and Kellis's daughter is like this grand sorceress general who has, in my opinion, the best fight scene of the entire series. Her versus the dragon, like, again, princess versus the dragon, but not in the way you expect. Just amazing. I reread just that part sometimes because it's so good.
Yes. No, I think it's that scene in particular, right? There's a lot of great fight scenes in the series, but the whole of the finale of the Unholy Consult is like this, the huge battle that we've been building to for the entire series, basically, of all
the different things that are going on, and so the last two books suffer from a little bit of an editing problem. The Bakker, unfortunately, the people who were publishing this books just kind of pushed the last two books out with a poor pass at editing. They're still worth reading. I realize that a lot of people are like, these are not the strongest books in the series, and they're not, but they're excellent. And if you can let the author's passion carry you through, it will cover a multitude of mistakes.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it's interesting because the beginning of the Judging Eye feels very much like the logical extension of where we left off in Thousandfold Thought. That it's like, there's all this stuff that's been happening in the world, but especially with Achaemeon, that he's like, I'm still a grumpy old man, and it's just been like 20 years hiding out by myself, and we're back to adventures, right? And that the shift from the end of White Luck to the beginning of the Great Ordeal feels a lot more significant to me, because Great Ordeal really starts off really dark. I mean, for a series that is really dark, that in particular felt to me like, oh man, this has gotten a whole lot darker faster than I expected compared to some of the other shifts, which is an interesting.
And it's interesting because you have this. One of the main things that happens, if I remember correctly, like at the end of White Luck Warrior, is when
they find out that Ishwal has been burned.
Been burned,
and you also
shrank. That's right. That's what I was like. That's when they make the decision. So the Shrank are these genetically they're the orcs and right. You have this character who's this really fascinating new character in the series, who is like, listen, you guys don't understand Shrank. My people from my city state, we've been fighting Shrank. The only reason they're not in the south where you guys are from is because of us.
Yeah.
And logistically, they can't keep the army supplied from the south all the way to the ancient north. And so the plan that is revealed at the end is like, no, what we're going to do is we're going to start eating Shrank. And if you pay attention, that character has definitely warned several times about that there is an unclean that happens when people eat shrank, and anybody who's discovered eating shrank is like sent out of the city and then just like, or killed.
Yeah.
And yes, it's that act of what's essentially cannibalism, completely corrupts the soul of the Great Ordeal. And it does so very quickly. And that act of depravity seems to be freeing for the Great Ordeal. They can see better in the dark. They're more violent. They're strong. They think it's because they're eating meat again, but there's something weird going on. The shrinks start avoiding them because they're like, oh no. Mm-hmm. You don't know whether it's that they're starting to see these people as themselves, or whether like the depravity of humanity has finally overcome the depravity of the shrank. But then there's like, this violence is then turned inward on the Great Ordeal, and is turned inward on the people who are part of it. And we see very honorable, noble characters just descend into complete and utter degeneracy. And you're kind of like, when Kellis returns is like, you guys are all damned. You're like, no, I've been reading about their damnation for the last book. And you're right. Like, just wipe them off the face of the planet, Kellis. And he's like, but now you have nothing to lose. So let's go win this war. And I'm like, oh, nope, that's totally a Dunyan move.
Yeah, it's
like,
the shortest path. This is the shortest only way to feed the army. So
yeah, but also to get those men into the position where they, it's the burning of the ships.
Yeah. This is
like,
you don't have any other option now.
Yeah, if you wipe these out, I'm going to tell you that if you finally are the people who overthrow the consult and pull this festering thorn out of the flesh of the world, that's going to redeem you. And everybody's like, oh God, okay, we're here for it. I mean, you can't, like, he forges that army step by step in blood and shit. Pardon my to make them the weapon that he needs them to be. And it still doesn't end with. Yeah. This is not a happy ending.
Not
like, even in like First Law gets not a happy ending, but it gets an ending, and you're like, these people will continue.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's
a lot.
I think it is this sort of huge fantasy series that I suspect that people either respond like us and are like, oh, this is like something that's not really like anything else. It's this kind of huge thing that you just kind of have to accept on the terms of this particular story. And if you do that, you'll like a lot of the thing. If you like the things that are being, thematically concerned with in this story, you'll probably like this. And I think there are a lot of people who would bounce off of it, and I also feel like you said, I can't really recommend this to anybody who doesn't discover it themselves and is like, oh, I guess I like this, and be like, okay, well, you should read the rest of them because they're really good still. But just saying to somebody like, oh yeah, you should read this book that is about all of these things that it ends up being about. It's like, no, I can't.
Yeah, horrible assault monsters from the north. Yeah. And the fact that the main bad guy introduces his species as a race of lovers should but all right, so I have a love of grimdark, and which may seem weird because of, like, people know me, right? I'm Anglican. I come from I did my master's in theology. I come from a very a strong sort of Christian worldview, and they're like, well, how can you read this? And I'm not saying that Christians should read it, or if you're not a Christian, you should read it, or like anything like that. But I think what attracts me to grimdark is there's this scene in, and I'm stealing this from my buddy Richard Rowland, who did a course on Dante, and we've talked a lot about Dante together. But there's this scene in the Inferno when Virgil and Dante are coming up to the Medusa, and all of the Medusa's victims are around, and it's this and Virgil's like, listen, this is the one thing up until this point that I'm going to tell you can't look at. Don't look at the Medusa. And this has become like a reoccurring phrase in our friend group. Mm-hmm. Don't look at the Medusa. And the idea is that despair is something that is very hard to fight on our own, and that there are some things that we look at that can only cause despair. I mean, we have our, or I was, we literally call looking at like social media doom scrolling. I'm like, we're looking at the Medusa people like as a, but I think grimdark, and especially some of the ways that Arlen, you and I have been talking about this series, one of the beauties of grimdark is it's the mirror to look at the Medusa through. I don't want to read about horrible things going on in our world, but when I'm exposed to them in grimdark, I can wrestle with this problem of evil. I can wrestle with this the misogyny that is kind of on display in these books, or the violence that is going on, sexual and otherwise, and go, okay, but all right, so what do I do if I encounter this? And I don't have to do it in the real world where I would just crawl into a fetal position and not want to interact because the despair would overwhelm me. I think grimdark allows us to have this, right? The hero doesn't kill Medusa by looking at her. He has to like look in the reflection, and that's kind of how I see grimdark. Grimdark is this mirror that we can hold up to our world, and it's just separated enough that we can read through it and go, okay, how do I respond to that? What does that provoke in me? Again, without just collapsing into complete and utter despair.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe why read this series in particular, because it sounds so grim in some
it does
way,
it is,
and it is really grim to read, but there is a real way of approaching issues that are not fictional, but in a fictional way that is I think positive. And I think I think this series in particular is also a really like I said, of like fantasy deconstruction and response, and a really interesting thing for someone who wants to take their fiction seriously, both kind of thematically, but also on like the sort of literal level of like, well, how do things happen in a world that is not like ours in all of the ways, but does like the rules of physics are mostly the same and all that. And there's something, I think this is a really interesting demonstration of that concept, among other things. There's a line in right near the beginning of White Luck Warrior where they talk about an imperial mathematician who is asking why the sort of frontier edge against the Srank has not been pushed back any further, and suggests that the scalpers, the men who have been sent out to go hunt down Srank, have encountered a population that is recovering as fast as they can kill them, basically, and so it won't get pushed back any further. And that concept by itself is such a fun, like, oh, this is like a world with all of the like ecological expectations that we would have from ours, that is just a part of what these people live with. And I think that also ties in with part of why the grimdark stuff really works, because those really dark things are just, that's a part of what a real world that takes seriously all of these influences is like, in a way that is I mean, you wouldn't want to live there, but it is interesting to find out about.
So it's like the meme that goes around where it's like, all right, everybody, you get to go live in your favorite, media property, and all the 40K players are like, no, like somebody redid that for the Bakker. We're like, none of us want to go there. But there is joy in visiting. I don't know how to explain it.
Yeah, right? Well, and I think there is a real like there's something fun about visiting. I think it is somebody was talking about specifically the way that the story is told, and this idea of the kind of purple prose flavoring of it. And I think it is such a fun, like, this is especially just on the level of the way the story is told, kind of unrepentantly fascinated by the kind of flavor of fantasy that it is, basically. That this is not like one type of, basically this is a book series that the author and even on like the basic stylistic level is very aware of what it is and what it's about, and is really excited about that in a way that I think there are a lot of other series that I've read where I've been like, well, you clearly like wanted to be writing something a little different and got kind of pushed into a market niche or something like that, and it's interesting for this to be so much, and partly probably because it is so like completely unadaptable with all of the issues of sexual violence in particular, so like hard to market on a basic level, that this is just like, well, this is one guy's kind of vision of what a fantasy series could be, and it's taken kind of as far as you could take it within that limitation.
Yeah, no, I agree. Bakker is unrelenting and unrepentantly Bakker.
Yeah.
Like that's the only way to kind of explain it. And I think he is the kind of a perfect example of the guy who is writing, right? Stephen King says you should only ever write for one person. You should write for yourself. And if anyone else happens to like it, you're a lucky person. And Bakker's clearly writing the kind of fantasy he like. It's clear that he loves Tolkien, and he's gone on record saying he loved Tolkien. Tolkien's Middle Earth, he said, feels scriptural to him. It feels real, and he always wanted to like capture that verisimilitude. That like this is not just like the books are a window into a real place, and it's very clear to me. Erwa is a real place to Bakker, and there's joy in seeing someone at that level of craft and passion bringing an internal landscape to life. And man, Erwa's real. Like, as far as I'm concerned, like all of those characters, they feel real. They don't feel like. I just finished reading The Rift War Cycle by Raymond Feist. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Like, I've read the first Rift War trilogy multiple times, like growing up. But I was like, half price books always had like the books for like $1.99 or $2.99. So I got them all and I read through them. Loved it. Don't know that I'll ever reread it. And the characters always sort of felt like, I mean, I connected with them. I loved Pug and Thomas and Magnus and, Jimmy and all of them. But they always felt like characters in a novel I was reading. Mm-hmm. Like, I've had conversations with a commune. I've had, I viscerally hate people in this, like, the Michael Scott, if you had these people in your and Toby, who would you shoot? Well, I'd ignore the first two and shoot Toby 3 times. There's a bunch of Tobys in here where I'm just like, no, if I had the chance to end this person's threat to this fantasy world, I'd do it. I'd go back in time and kill him as a baby. All fictional. But like, I have this here. I've got this visceral like response, and it's beautifully. The Erickson quotes on the front of Whitelock Warrior, I don't think that's the one that I read originally, but it's exquisitely intelligent and beautifully written. This is fantasy with muscle and brains. Yeah. I'd pick that book up right now because I trust Erickson. But
no, I feel like this is a natural stopping place to say, if somehow you have gotten to this point and haven't read these books, I think you owe it to yourself to at least read like the prologue of The Darkness That Comes Before and see if, because it's all there, all of the stuff that are like all the interesting things in the story are present even from that early on. And if you're hooked by that, then read the rest. And if you are not hooked by it, then don't read it. And if you are hooked and get to something that is upsetting later on, then I don't know, leave a comment or a dislike or something, because I'm sorry about that. But having lived with this series for so long, I do think that this is a really special fantasy series and worth checking out if this sounds like something that you'd be into. Yeah,
it's one of 4 series that I regularly reread. Like every couple of years, I go through Malazan, Thomas Covenant, Tolkien, and Bakker. Like,
wow. Thank you so much for joining me,
Oh,
JM.
my pleasure.
It
Yeah.
was great fun. I'm glad we got to do this. We had talked about doing something like this years and years ago, I think.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it was great fun. It's super fun to talk about our Scott
Yeah,
Bakker
I always
books.
enjoy conversations with you, Arlen. So, like, anytime you want to talk stuff, please
All right.
let me know.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
I'm here
We'll
for
figure
it.
out. Maybe I'll read all of Thomas Covenant and we'll talk about that or something.
That's a
Yeah.
uh,
Well, that's like what, 12 or 14 books, something.
two trilogies and one tetralogy. So you're
All
looking at
right.
10
10
books.
books.
And
That's not as bad as the Wheel of Time even. But
no,
yeah.
you. I mean, and they're all shorter than the Wheel of
Yeah.
Time. But you get to, that series. If this series is about darkness and meaning, that whole series is about the conservation of beauty,
Hmm.
and what does it mean to actually like preserve beauty, and it's really good. It's really good.
Yeah. Well, and I reread the Lord of the Rings trilogy earlier this year also, so that was super fun
Nice.
to
Yeah,
go
yeah,
back
yeah.
to. Despite, I mean, I was familiar with all of the things because I read them, like 5 or 6 times when I was a kid, and then I've seen the
Yeah,
movies a bunch of times. But it was
yeah.
a lot of fun to go back. So it's definitely we'll see if we can't figure out fantasy series to talk about after this
Uh,
one.
Let me know. I'm
All
here.
right. Yeah, yeah. Cool. Well, that's going to be it for us for today, I think. But leave a comment down below or whatever else if you're interested. If you've read these books and you liked them, or if you didn't like them, I guess leave a comment too. And yeah, that's going to be it. So thank you so much for watching or listening. I've been Arlen Walker, joined by J-M DeFoggi. I mentioned we should go back. I mentioned Iconic Productions is your YouTube channel, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
Jackals
I
from Osprey Games, and
Yep.
anything else you want to plug, I guess.
Oh, sure. My company, Strange Owl Games, we actually have a crowdfunding going on right now for the fifth edition update for World's Largest Dungeon that's doing really well on BackerKit. And partnered with that, we have I can provide you the link so you can put it in the show notes. We actually are doing a contest called Portals to Adventure. We've expanded the World's Largest Dungeon out with a book called Secret Doors, where we basically got a bunch of industry people to write adventures for their game world that connects to a secret door from World's Largest Dungeon. So, like Stephen Chenault is doing it from Castles and Crusades, and I have one that connects to the Jackals world, and Gareth Ryder Hanrahan is, I think, doing a 13th Age adventure. But what we want to do is we want to have industry professionals, but we also want people who are complete amateurs. So there's a website called Portals to Adventure where you can submit your small dungeon idea. It's 4 pages, and then people are going to vote on it. And the people with the most votes not only get to get printed in the book, but several companies have partnered with us and put up cash prizes for people to do this. And so it's open for like the next couple of weeks. So if you're at all interested, head over to the link that I'm sure will be down in the,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
believe it
Put
is
it in.
termed the doobly doo. And
Nice.
I will get that over to Arlen. And Arlen, if you've got a dungeon adventure, go ahead and submit it.
We'll see. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sounds cool. Awesome.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
I've been live from Palace Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.